All right, we're going to call the meeting to order. Mayor Bowling will have our invocation and lead us in the pledge.
Please pray with me. Father God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to come and, Lord, to do the people's business. Lord, we thank you for your love and for knowing that you were with us tonight. Lord, we pray the things that we do will be pleasing to you. Lord, we're thankful for all the work that has gone in, countless hours, years that have gone into bringing us to this point tonight of actually being able to make a decision on the settlement agreement. Thank you for those that have worked so hard and that have prepared tonight to be able to present in a way that will be understanding to all that are here. Thank you for our elected officials that are here tonight that will make decisions. Lord, we pray your protection over our community and for those that protect and serve. And we pray these things in your holy and precious name. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Flags this way. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mayor. All right, roll call for the City Council.
Ladner.
Here.
McMasters.
Here.
Jackson. Here. Pike.
Here.
Pepper.
And I'll turn it over to Chairman Long for his roll call.
We'll do the same thing. We'll have a roll call for the County Commission.
Chairman Ray Long.
Here.
Commissioner Jeff Clark. Here. Commissioner Randy Vest. Here. Commissioner Don Stisher. Commissioner Greg Abercrombie. Here. Chairman, you have a quorum. You may proceed.
Okay. If you'll see the agenda down in front of you, everybody's had time to look over it. There's only two items on there. One is approving the agreement, and then the other is to adjourn. We need a motion and a second to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Motion, Mr. Clark.
Second.
Second, Mr. Vest.
Clark.
Yes.
Vest.
Yes.
Abercrombie.
Thank you. Motion passes. Turn it back over.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here tonight. The purpose of this meeting is to hear the summary of the 3M settlement and settlements in the St. John and Tennessee Riverkeeper cases. We'll hear from attorneys for the City of Decatur, the lead plaintiff's attorney in the St. John case, the lead attorney for the Tennessee Riverkeeper group as well. We'll also hear from Intersolve, Pewright McAnally, and an expert involved in the St. John case. After these presentations, we will entertain any public comments. We did have a sign-in sheet, and I believe we have everybody that signed in recorded here. With the public comments, we will maintain our usual method of 3 minutes to speak and not repeating what previous speakers have said. After public comments are concluded, the Decatur City Council will entertain a motion to approve the settlements, followed by the County Commission. We will not take any questions from the media as part of the meeting, but members of the City Council and County Commission can do that after we adjourn the meeting as they wish. So with that, I will turn this over to Mr. Lovelace to start the presentation.
Good evening. The camera's back there and y'all are speaking here, so I'm going to kind of be going back and forth, so please understand. I wanted to give a brief overview for those of you who have not lived and breathed this like some of us have for years and years, of the two cases, and you heard him mention two cases. There's something that we all refer to as lawyers as the St. John case. That was actually filed in 2002 in the Circuit Court of Morgan County, is still pending 19 years later. Leon Ashford, who is one of the attorneys and the lead attorney in that case for the plaintiffs, which is a class action, is going to speak tonight and can address matters relating to that case. The city and the county were named as defendants in that case in 2015. Then you have another case that we refer to as the Riverkeeper case the Tennessee River Keeper Group, who's here with their lead attorney, Bill Matakuskas, right? That's a little bit of an inside joke with us about saying his name. I know you can't tell from the name that he's from New Jersey, and we welcome him to the South. But they filed a suit under federal law in federal court in 2016, and the city and the county were named in that, along with other parties, 3M and others also. An unusual thing happened in those two cases. I've talked to a lot of attorneys, and I don't know that I found one yet that have found where there was a case in federal court and a case in state court with two different judges, two different jurisdictions that were jointly mediated together. And that's what happened in this case, or these cases. And that mediation has been going on for over 5 years, started in January of 2016. It was ordered by the judges in the two cases, and by law, those mediation processes are confidential, which was frustrating at times for the public and for the media, but that's the way that process works. And so we had to abide by the court's order of that and the law governing the confidentiality of it. I think it's really important for everyone to particularly know what these cases are and what they're not. These cases relate to property damage claims only. The Riverkeeper case has what we call injunctive relief. That would be to enjoin somebody to do something or not to do something, and Bill can talk about that later. But they're only property damage claims. So from our standpoint in representing the city and the county, and when I say the city and the county, I'm including Decatur Utilities. It might surprise you, but Decatur Utilities is not a separate legal entity. It's really part of the city, but they are, we all know they have their own separate board and how they operate. So those claims involved, obviously claims involving the concern about the environment as a whole, which obviously the city and the county and DU were very concerned about too. But it also involved any properties owned by the city and the county and DU that might have been contaminated with PFAS over the years, and we're going to talk about that later on. They do not involve, at least as the city and the county and DU could not pursue any claims for any private landowners for any property damage claims. That would be something that you would have to do and get your own lawyer. These cases have nothing to do at all with any personal injury claims. And again, that would be something, if you feel like that's something that affects you, that you would need to talk to your own lawyer about. This is kind of an understatement, but these cases involve very complex legal, factual, and scientific issues. And all the parties, we had lawyers from California to New Jersey to Chicago and everywhere in between. And all of these lawyers and all of their experts and all of their clients worked diligently throughout this mediation process to get to where we are today. And I will say this, that one of the most important things, at least from our client standpoint, was to be transparent with the public. I think for those of you who have seen the website, the caterpfas.info, that you have seen probably more information on a topic and put together. That was done by the McComb Group. I worked with them. But this settlement did not, that website went live at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, and we got the last edit to the settlement agreements at 1:14 that afternoon. So it was every night for at least a week or two before, trying to get to the point where we were, because we all knew we had a deadline of November 1st, or the latest deadline, and we wanted to all meet it. And so I think that was important for all the parties to get us to that point. Our law firm, I'm in the law firm of Harris, Cadell, and Shanks, and many of you know that law firm. But we've been involved in this case as far back as the best I can tell, probably 2003, 4, or 5. Bob Harris, who represented Decatur Utilities for many, many years, and Bill Sheehan, who was the county attorney for many, many years, and at the time Herman Marks with the city, were involved in a lot of different meetings and discussions with Leon and others about this issue that far back. And we've got files that relate to this matter that go back that far. And so this is the culmination for everyone of decades of work. And I think that you'll see when we go through this presentation in a minute that we are really accomplishing what we set out to accomplish. And what did we set out to accomplish? David Langston and I were representing the city and the county and DU. And Bob Harris and Bill Sheehan have since died. They were great lawyers, but that's how long this case has been going on. But we had a goal, David and I did, and with our clients, that I'm going to tell you these 3 goals that we had. And I think all of them were equally as important, as one was not more important than the other. First off, we wanted to be sure that the city and the county and DU did not face financial ruin. Because when we started involving matters involving PFAS, when we started doing this, they didn't have any environmental liability insurance. And we didn't have any idea of what this might entail in the standpoint of cleanup and what we'd be facing. So that was obviously a very key and important factor. The second, we wanted to make sure that all the property owned by the city and the county and DU was investigated and remediated for any contamination from PFAS. And third, and just as important, the city and the county and DU wanted to make sure that the environment in our community was taken care of and was investigated for PFAS and remediated. And I think that I can say very confidently and very proud that we've gotten all of those 3 issues accomplished. You will see later in the presentation, I'm going to go over with you the goals of what the parties had in the mediation. And those goals are very important too, as it relates to every citizen in Decatur and Morgan County. And so why don't we, I guess I'd do this. I hit this button here, see if I can do that. I already hit it wrong. So what is PFAS? That's what we call it. When I first started doing this, they called it PFC for the acronym, and then it went to PFAS. But they were first invented in the 1930s, and you find them in a lot of different products. They're everywhere in the environment. A lot of people know about them, and they're non-stick, pots and pans and things of that nature. Waterproof coatings. So I've already told you a little bit about this, about the mediation and the 2 cases, and the unusual move there was about that we were putting the 2 mediations together, and that we were working together, very importantly, for the good of the residents of Decatur and Morgan County, as well as the other plaintiffs in the cases. That gives you the key personnel. You're going to hear from every one of those people tonight. The other lawyers, Craig Benson. I tell people that my resume is 2 pages long. It may really be just 1. Craig's is like 200. It's on the website. You can click on his name and you can read it if you're really, really bored. But he's got more things than Carter's got pills. But he's been an expert, that one of 6 that Leon has had, that's been very instrumental in helping us get to where we are today. And then you see the other people here who are listed. Of course, you all know Donnie Lane with Intersolve and Blake McAnally with Pew Wright. Donnie and his firm were our environmental and consultants in the litigation and did a tremendous amount of testing all over Decatur and the water, and he's going to talk about that. And Blake and his firm for decades have been the engineers for our landfill, and he's going to talk to you about the part of our settlement that I'll briefly mention about how we're addressing the issue involving our landfill, which is very important. And the landfills are one of the things that Dr. Benson has particular expertise in, and that'll come up later. So, did I hit it? Let me see what I do. I told you earlier what mediation was. It's confidential. It's not binding unless the parties reach their own agreement. It's not like arbitration, which is binding. And the parties, you know, we worked together, and we had a lot of tense moments. We had a lot of back and forth, but that's part of what the process is. My wife often says even though her father was a lawyer, her father was Bill Sheehan, that she couldn't do all this adversarial stuff that we do all the time. But it was a good process. Here's the goal in the mediation that the parties agreed to. We wanted to lessen the potential harm to health or the environment from the past disposal of those chemicals in and around Decatur. And let me say, when I say lessen, I think everyone would agree that's an expert in this and much more than me, you're not going to eliminate these chemicals from our environment. The best we can do is try to significantly reduce their continued discharge, and what we've got going on in this litigation and this settlement accomplishes that. We wanted to reduce any more PFOA and PFOS going into the Tennessee River for obvious reasons, for our fish and for our recreational use. We wanted to make sure that the monetary relief and the remediation work to be provided by the defendants were sufficient to achieve these objectives. And we wanted to ensure, and this is a key thing, that these chemicals that would remain would not present an imminent and substantial endangerment to health or the environment. And that's very key. It's very key to all of us. It's very important to me. I've got a boat, and I fish, and I do recreation on the river just like many of us do. Now, the Decatur Daily's done a good job of telling you about this part of the city and the county and DU settlement of $98.4 million, but you're going to find out in a minute that this settlement of all these cases is really $250 million. It's really $250 million spent to date. And if I had to be a guess, and I probably shouldn't say this, we'll probably see that much spent in the future. But this is significant. But as the ADEM director said, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, there's no cap in this litigation or this settlement or what ADEM of what they've got to spend to do what they're supposed to have to do under these settlements, and that's important. But the city of Decatur and the county and DU, you see how that's broken down between the different parties and between the different matters that we've done there. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to say something now that I'm not very good, some people may not agree with this, about trying to talk about the work that David and I did, but Leon will talk about this, but the law in Alabama was very, very limited of what we could recover. And I believe if you talk to most all the other defendant parties in here, we had our own separate negotiation with 3M. We're pretty surprised at what we end up with. In Alabama, under the law, for damages for pollution to your property, this is a case filed with the Alabama Supreme Court that I promised Eric Flesher I will send him, and I forgot, but I'm going to do it. It says you get the difference between what was the value of your property before the pollution and what was your value of your property after the pollution, not the cost to remediate it. So the case that I'm talking about, I'm using make-up numbers. The property was worth, say, $500,000. It had a pipeline that spilled oil in it and it was polluted, and so they said the value of it was zero, but the cost to remediate it was $2 million. And the Alabama Supreme Court said you don't get the cost to remediate the $2 million, you get the 500 less the zero, the most you can recover is 500,000. So when you look at the $35 million for the Aquadome, ask yourself, because I know I've talked to appraisers, if we had to go to court, what is the value of that property sitting on top of an old landfill without PFAS and a 52-year-old recreational facility. As one appraiser told me, he said, Barney, if you could give it to somebody, that's the value of it. 3M paid us $35 million for that. And I'm proud of that. And I'm proud that 3M did it. It's important to this community that they did that. You'll hear something about money, other money going, and you may hear some people talk about reputational damage. And I know that our clients feel like there's a lot of people that we've had these chemicals in the news for a long, long time, and that affects our reputation. There's no recovery under Alabama law for that, zero. And so out of that 25 million, 18 million is being split between the city and the county and DU. We're going to talk about the capping of the landfill. We had documented between the Cato Utilities and our landfill, $9.2 million they had spent over the last 10 or 15 years on PFAS-related expenses, and they reimbursed us for those expenses. And then DU and their, you know, I like the word they use. I call it a sewer plant, but everybody else calls it a wastewater treatment plant. And then everybody else calls it a WWTP. You know, I'm glad you learn this. But their sewer plant creates sludge, and you have to dispose of it somewhere. And that's the estimated cost of the next 20 years to dispose of that sludge that DU will receive. So I'm not trying to applaud 3M, but 3M, they did the city and the county and DU right on these things. And I think that's important. I think that they recognized how important the city and the county and DU were to them for the last 50 plus years, and that they wanted to do right, as I would call it. So what are some of the components of the settlement? Our landfill, and I always kind of get a joke about saying this, and I can't say that to Ricky Terry because he's not here. He was the longtime landfill director, but Wanda Tyler, who's here, is now. We don't have a cell number one. Our landfill cell started with number 2, and it's a long story. But so when cells number 2 through 11, which comprise about 100 acres, and Blake's going to talk more about this, when they were first constructed in the early 80s, it was before Subtitle D law became in place that governs about how do you build a landfill, what do you have to do to construct it. And one of the things you have to do now is you have to have a synthetic liner, I'm putting it simplistic, on the bottom of the landfill. And then the other part you have to have is when you close the landfill, you have to have a synthetic liner on top. Because you can imagine, you're going to hear the word leachate a lot. The water goes through the landfill, and it's leaching through everything that's in there, and it comes out down to the bottom. And I've seen what leachate looks like, and it's not pretty. But the cap, obviously, helps to stop that rainwater, and we've all seen what people at 3M has been doing on their own site, okay? So that's important. And our cell was closed before then, these cells were. So this is going to cap it, and not just with one synthetic layer. Blake designed it. We sent it to the St. John and Riverkeeper lawyers and their experts and Dr. Benson, and they came back and said, we think you ought to have 2 synthetic liners, and 3M agreed to that, and we certainly agreed with it. So this will be a really big deal in regards to what PFAS is going to continue to be discharged out. Then they've got to investigate about PFAS in the groundwater at our landfill. And they've got to do it under ADM guidance, and they've got to do it to ADM standards, and they may have to do some remediation over there, just like they're doing remediation of the groundwater at their own plant. Then we have an open air leachate pond that hadn't been in use for over a decade. But the landfill used to send their leachate to this pond, and it basically just evaporated, either down or up. Well, that wasn't a good plan long term. It got to be too much leachate, and we found out about the PFAS, and now, you know, it's discharged to DU. So they've got to go in there and and take up all that dirt, remediate, add new dirt, do all that to ADEM standards, and that's going to be important because it's still a pond out there and it rains and it's still got water in it. 3M is under something called an interim consent order. And if you're really bored and really want, it is very, very comprehensive. And as ADEM's director said when they announced it, there's no cap on what 3M has got to spend. But one of the things they've got to do is they've got to investigate and remediate any sites where PFAS waste from the 3M plant was disposed. Many, many of the sites that are listed in a minute were discovered during this litigation, and Leon and Riverkeeper and David and I made 3M and ADEM aware of them. So there are a lot of sites that have already been identified. And I told you about what the director said about that they'd have to pay the full cost with no cap. The sites involved, you'll see the ones in Morgan County and Lawrence County. Those are the ones that are already identified with ADEM and that work is being done to investigate them. Leon's case involves the sludge from DU sewer plant that was applied to around 5,000 acres of various farms in the area that were happy to get it, and it was done under an EPA permit. Then, you know, we find out what's there, and Leon can talk more about that. So you get a lot of questions. I've already talked about what they were, and they are very persistent. Sometimes you hear they call the forever chemicals. They don't break down, and they can accumulate over time. And let's talk about drinking water. And I think this is very, very important to everyone. Our drinking water is safe. We'll say that again. Our drinking water is safe. No questions about it. There is PFAS in drinking water everywhere. The EPA has set an advisory, not a regulation, not a requirement, that you should have no more than 70 parts per trillion for your lifetime of combined of PFOA and PFOS. That's an advisory, 70 parts per trillion. Used to be a parts per billion, and they reduced it, and they may change it here in the future, and that's addressed in this litigation. Ours is around 5. Donnie's firm went all the way up to Stevenson, Alabama, and there's PFAS in the river all the way up there coming down here. It's just everywhere. They found it in polar bears in Antarctica. So, you know, it's there. But our water is, without question, very safe. Here we go. And there was this group, this environmental working group. It's an environmental advocacy group like the Tennessee Riverkeepers who came and tested our water. We didn't even know they did. And they published their reports. It showed that our water was completely safe and met or exceed all state and federal regulatory standards. Their test had it at 4.5 done in 2020, a combined 4.5. So we've tested it many times, and we are confident about that. Obviously, it's important that our water treatment plan and the intake for that is upriver of where the PFAS is being discharged on downriver, as we know. What is a part per trillion when you hear about, well, I think the best thing I heard, 1 second in almost 32,000 years when you talk about, you know, so you take about 70 parts per trillion, you're talking about, I don't know what 70 into 32,000 is, but 1 square inch and 250 square miles. It's a minute amount, but we are by far, we're more than 10 times below that level. We put this on the website and gave you the numbers and the averages. And let me tell you this, I think everybody would agree that the testing for PFAS is not, I hate to use the word inexact. It's not, I could take 1 sample of water right now and then turn right around and get another sample and give them to the same group, and they do a blind test and they'd come up with different numbers. It's it's pretty accurate, but it's not going to be 100%, absolute. It's just too many variables in it. But that's the numbers that we have here. There are a lot of people ask, I use the river, I swim in the river, I do things in the river, and this tells you what Dr. Scott Harris said as a state health officer, that swimming or swallowing or dermal contact with PFAS is not expected to cause harm to human health. I've got more cites to that issue from other state regulatory agencies if you're interested in that. So that's important to all of us here. It's important that the pool at the Aquadome is the same water that you drink at home. It's around 5 parts per trillion. It's not anything to be harmful from. 3 old closed landfills. As those that were involved very intimately in the litigation knew, the city of Decatur owned 3 closed landfills. The Brookhaven Aquadome, where they owned the Aquadome portion of that site, which was 25 acres. They owned a 40-acre site out on Old Moulton Road near Mud Tavern. And they owned an 80-acre site, approximately these, out on Deer Springs Road in Flint. All of those have been closed for decades. I'm not sure how to say this, but Donnie Lane called me up one day and said, Barney, I want to talk to you about these 3 closed landfills. And we talked about it, and it was on nobody's radar anywhere. Nobody had discussed it at all, brought it up at all, anything. And we talked about it, and if you go out and the ditch out at Brookhaven, it's a pretty deep ditch, and it's grass size and got a concrete bottom. Donnie went out there one night after a heavy rain and water leached out of the side and took samples of that and sent it off and got the results, and it showed it had PFAS. So then he went to Flint, and then he went to Mud Tavern, and they all had PFAS, and then we notified 3M and ADM. And that's where we are today. Now, as you can imagine, those landfills were closed long before Subtitle D. And there's no telling what else is in those landfills besides PFAS. But it was very, very important to the city, understandably, that 3M take title to those 3 landfills. They were willing to indemnify us for PFAS. We wanted them to take title to it and get that off our books. And it took a long time, and some of them up here may be shaking their head, but we were able to get that accomplished. And that's really important, I think, going forward. They've obviously got to clean up those sites, investigate them, and do everything that ADM tells us. But that's very important to the city, but it's also important to our environment for those to be addressed. As part of the settlement, 3M is funding and has identified, that they want us to construct a new recreational facility. And I think that's great for not only just the citizens of Decatur, but we all got to remember Morgan County is inside Decatur. And so the citizens of the county and anybody will have the opportunity to use this facility. That's a decision the city leaders will make about where it'll go and what it'll have. They've identified this possible site. That's not for the lawyers to be involved in, though. Some people may recognize that site as being right downtown as a possible site. And that's a conceptual drawing of what you could have there. But this is what I wanted to really touch on about the $250+ million part of the settlement. You got 98.4 for us. You've got $5 million to the farmers. The other defendants have identified 3M and Daikin and Toray and BFI $147 million to date in remediation cost. And you notice that big question mark over there. The estimated future remediation cost is not capped. It's unlimited in the future. And that's extremely important to all of us. All of us. So you can go to this website, as I've mentioned to you before. And what I know you've heard enough from me, and I know we got the Braves on, okay? I'm very cognizant of that. My son is here, and he's reminded me of that, the last thing I said to him. I'm going to call on Donnie Lane now to come up and talk, or do you have a mic? Can they give this one here? Did they say that you want to come up here, or you want to take this one? Okay. And Donnie's going, y'all know who Donnie is?
Can you hear me okay? My voice is a little bit weak. About 5 years ago, my good Lord blessed me with Parkinson's, and so I have a few things that I have to deal with from time to time. Sometimes I can't just stand up for a long period of time, but I would like to know where the guy has a 3-minute clock. And you take it away from him? The thing one of the things I like to do in an environment like this is every day I get up and I have the opportunity to work with 78 employees in 3 companies that we own here in Decatur, Morgan County. And I can tell you that I'm 60 years old, born and raised here in Morgan County, and we're concerned about what goes on in this county, particularly the river and the areas that we use for recreation. In 2007, we began working with Barney and with some of the employees at Decatur Utilities. The first thing that we knew at that point in time was that we had contamination basically coming from the landfill, going to Decatur Utilities, through the treatment process, back to the landfill. And at that point in time, we all thought that was what we were dealing with. But I can tell you, since that time, that area has expanded to where you see the Flint landfill all the way back around to BFI and even Moulton, City of Moulton. So the community here has been diligent about researching facilities. 3M has been diligent about responding to those requests and those questions that we have. And you see my hands may shake a little bit. I make a great shaking martini. I just don't like to drink them. So, but as the process started in 2007, technology was not where it is today. And so as we went through the process in that very first evaluation of PFAS in this community, we went and we sampled every collection point in the city, every location. We measured flows there, we did mass balances, and at that point in time, we were focused on 2 things: the landfill at Decatur, the landfill at BFI and Moulton in Lawrence County. But as technology became better and better, detection limits were being driven down. And so we went back in 2019, I think, and we redid that collection system study just to see, before we can do anything about it, we got to know where it's at. And so we did that. Detection limits went from part per million range in 2007 to part per trillion range today. So what that did is that just put a more impetus on us to identify these signs. You hear people say that this chemical is a forever chemical. It is, but it's no different than anything else we live and work with every day in our environment. We have to be careful about the things we do at our plants. We have to be careful about the things we do in our homes. But 3M's identified these sites. Blake McAnally and I, we have opportunity every day, if we want to walk on one. They're cleaned up right now. Once the sites are identified, the work plans are put together, and they're working on getting that material out of our environment. The significance of what's happening with 3M and with this community and the amount of money that we're doing is we're on the forefront in this country of dealing with PFAS compounds. We're learning more. We've got a municipal government here, a county government, a city government that understands what we've got to do and what it means to us as people that live in this community. And I've lived here every day of my life, except when I was at Auburn. I've got 2 kids, 1 grandbaby on the way, and I can tell you, I'm gonna live out my life in Decatur, Alabama on Wood Trail Drive. And the reason I'm able to do that is because of the work that's been done here by Barney and his group. We appreciate the opportunities we've had to work with 3M. As a result of this consent order that they're working on right now, we've got 10 crews working at that plant every day of the world, 7 days a week. And I can tell you, 3M is diligent about what they're doing. And we see it just firsthand every day. Kind of to elaborate on what Barney was saying, our drinking water in Decatur, Alabama is safe. Our drinking water in the majority of communities across the U.S. is safe. You have some municipalities and some states that took the health advisory level to the nth degree, and it's just impossible. There's one state that has a health advisory level of 1 part per trillion. And I can tell you the cleanest water in the state of Alabama won't be at 1 part per trillion. It's just not capable, not really possible, and it's not needed. The concentrations that we deal with on a daily basis are in that range. Drinking water is going to be somewhere between 1 and 5, maybe 10. The advisory level is just exactly that. It's not a limit. There's no requirement by EPA or ADEM on that. And so we'll see concentrations that range from, like I say, 1 to about up 10. That's pretty well background. We went as far up the Tennessee River as we could go and just keep us downstream of the mills, the salt mills over in Georgia. That's where a lot of the PFCs were coming from, and it's also where some of the Gen X compounds were coming from. So, but it's been my pleasure to work with that. Every time I have a chance to talk about my employees, I do, because I'm gonna tell you, they're the ones that make it happen for us. So, the one thing that I do think we're gonna see is I think we're gonna see limits for drinking water at some point in the future. Decatur Utilities here, they're here tonight. They were up front and on the very point of this work when we started the work back in 2007. So, but anyway, you're dealing with a good set of people on the ground. The 3M environmental personnel, these little men and women are very good at what they do. We like to support them. They are supporting us. And this is important for us to realize how good a shape we are in Decatur, Alabama. And it didn't happen by accident. Marty. You're welcome.
Let me tell you. My mic live, okay. Let me tell you one important thing I left out. In the settlement that we have, you go ahead if you want to. In the settlement that we have, the city and the county and DU, we did not give 3M and the other parties a blanket release, as you hear about. We have the right, if the laws change or the facts change relating to PFAS, to pursue claims against them. That was very, very important to us and to we wouldn't have settled otherwise. And so if the drinking levels got way down and we exceeded them, we got a right to go back against them and to pursue claims for that. So I left that out, and that's very important. So I wanted you to know that. I'm going to call on Blake McAnally now to talk to you a little bit about the landfills.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to speak on behalf of the city and the county. We appreciate the opportunity and honor to have been a part of the project for many years to this point. I am the president of Pewright McAnally, and our firm have been involved in providing engineering services to the Morgan County Regional Landfill since the 1970s. My predecessor, Mr. Joe Pugh, actually put together the initial plan for the landfill as it is today, some 50 years ago. Morgan County and Decatur, as we have heard, have shared responsibilities in the landfill. Our work at the landfill from the operations side is working with the city of Decatur. We were involved prior to Subtitle D, that regulations that Barney mentioned previously becoming effective, and we've been involved since that time. Under Subtitle D, just so you understand the difference, landfill cells are lined and capped. They're enclosed, if you will, in plastic from the bottom and the top, and they're heat welded together and contain forever, essentially, anything stored within them. Prior to Subtitle D coming around in the late 70s, early 80s, landfills had dirt or clay liners and clay covers. You might understand the difference between having tightly compacted dirt or plastic and the effectiveness of those to be able to remove water or keep water from infiltrating into a landfill cell. Our PWM team has been involved in PFAS matters at the landfill since 2006, when we first began to test leachate streams for PFAS and to contemplate management of PFAS within the landfill. As has been said a couple of times tonight, because PFAS are so pervasive in the environment and then concentrated significantly so within the landfill, we understood that we had some challenges there in understanding what we had and how to deal with that. Barney had mentioned the word leachate. As he said, leachate is a liquid that percolates through landfills in the waste that has been stored there as it biodegrades. In the old landfills, prior to Subtitle D, that had a dirt cover, rainfall could accumulate and percolate through that soil into the landfill, through the landfill waste, and taking a lot of stuff with it, in addition to the expected and normal biodegrading of the material placed there, and would in fact enhance materials taken out of the landfill waste strata down to layers where the leachate is collected in the bottom of the landfills. The leachate has always been collected in the bottom of the landfill, whether they were lined or not. The leachate stream is then transferred when it is collected at the landfill to Decatur Utilities wastewater treatment plant. That's done so by underground collection pipes, pulling it into a wet well and a pump system, pumping it to gravity sewer, which ultimately ends up at Decatur wastewater treatment plant. Our team, along with the city of Decatur, have employed various devices and methods to reduce the amount of leachate that is collected in the landfill by reducing the amount of water that actually permeates through the landfill and to the leachate collection system. We've done this by early capping, where we have landfill cells that have closed. We've placed caps on them earlier. As Barney had mentioned earlier, cells 2 through 11 are those cells that do not have if you will, a plastic bottom liner and cap that is welded together. The landfill, beginning in cell 12 and 13, and as they go through the rest of the life of the landfill, which would be a few decades yet, those are actually lined with this plastic system and the top cover. And so we've done a few of those. In the last 5 to 6 years, we had 2 cells that we've closed in this way, in this newer technology under the new regulations. Okay. Existing, as I said, these cells 2 through 11 are what are planned as a part of the settlement, should it be approved, to have this final cover that consisting of multiple layers of synthetic membranes and soil. And hopefully not to bore you too much, but Barney asked me to elaborate just a bit upon the construction of the composite layer that will cap these cells 2 through 11 with. Beginning at the bottom, there is a geocomposite gas vent layer. As waste biodegrades, it creates methane. This layer has a strata in which it can capture gas and allow it an exit of the landfill. We, throughout the landfill at Morgan County Regional, have a contractor on site who actually collects the methane and uses that to generate electricity by way of generators and burning that methane. But some of it does and would escape to the air if not covered with this layer. 12 inches of soil goes on top of that layer, and then a geosynthetic clay liner. As Barney had mentioned, this was the layer that was suggested by Dr. Benson, who will, I think, speak shortly. And we agreed with him in doing that, as did 3M, as Barney said. Next is a low-density polyethylene liner, which is basically there to add a bit of strength to the layer. A geocomposite drainage layer that's on top. Above that is 12 inches of cover soil. And lastly, 6 inches of topsoil and a composite blend that will be grassed and maintained perpetually. So there's some 35 to 36 inches of surface that is created as the cap on top of what is now the existing soil cap in these cells 2 through 11. Together, all of these components produce a surface that is virtually impermeable to rainwater. This has proven to be a very effective process to limit PFAS transmission from the landfill by reduction of surface water infiltration into the landfill cells. Should the settlement be approved and work begin immediately, the suspense for this project will occur over a 2.5-year timeline. There's 3 phases to the project. First phase, it would be, presuming that we begin, should we begin in January coming, phase 1 is the scoping, schematic design, and planning for the process. That will go from January 22 through March 22. Phase 2 then would begin with the design, testing, permitting, preparation of bid documents, the bid process, as this would be a public money project and follow the Alabama state bid law process. And finally, the construction contract award. This process would go from April 22 through May of 2023. Finally, the phase 3 would be the actual construction of the project. The Alabama Department of Environmental Management's approval of the construction. There will be many inspections and milestones throughout the project at which they're going to be taking a look at it, along with our firm and consultants that we will employ to help us and do those. Final closeout being the last item, this phase 3 construction phase would begin presumably in June of 23 and finish in June of 25. A rather long process, but quite a bit of work to be done. Barney had already mentioned with respect to the landfill other things that may take place there. The settlement does provide for an extensive groundwater investigation that considers the whole of the landfill and the property around the extremes of the landfill, the existing stormwater impounding reservoir. Mr. Pugh always taught me that in the consulting world, we could be paid more for an impounding reservoir than a detention pond, so thus impounding reservoir, Barney. This work will produce a study that will be provided to ADEM for their review and approval. And beyond the approval of that plan, recommendations will come forward for any mitigation that might be required at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Let me say this. What occurs at our landfill and the end product in regards to what's discharged into the river or gets put back in our landfill is a very key component of this settlement. And it was important to us that we control that construction project. So Blake's firm will be have been and will be the designers of it, and will manage the construction of it and all through the permitting that has to be done and the approvals with ADEM. Under the terms of the settlement, once we get the bids in for the work, 3M pays that money to the city within 30 days. The landfill is owned jointly by the city and the county, but under an agreement by them, the city manages and operates it. Ray Long didn't like me to say this, but landfill ever gets upside down, then both parties have to split that cost halfway, and that's part of what I was telling you that they were all worried about when we started this whole process. We could not be where we are today without the Tennessee Riverkeeper Group and the St. John lawsuit. We very early on in the mediation, some have heard me say that we became plaintiffs, and we did because we had our own claims. We did not generate PFAS, and we did not, manufacture PFAS, and so we had our claims of our own, as evidenced by the $98.4 million settlement that we've reached. But Riverkeepers, they were very dogged, and Bill and his team and Leon and his team in pursuing this, and we could not have accomplished what we did if we had not worked with them, which was very important. So I'm going to call on Bill Matakuskas. I'm never going to get that right, Bill. I know. The joke about this is that we had a Zoom call the other day with Bill and Leon and myself, and at the end, Bill it was really funny. I'm not going to do it justice. He had this woman that was kind of dancing around the room saying his name so you could understand what his name was. And I still hadn't gotten it. So I'm just an old Southern boy. So Bill, thank you for being here.
That was from that was for a video from a campaign. She was teaching some people at a housing project how to say the name. So anyway, it's Bill Matsakudis, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to speak to the county commissioners, to the city council, and to the public. I'm a founding partner of the law firm of Matsakudis and Fanchulo, and part of what we do and focus on as lawyers is filing environmental litigation, sometimes on behalf of cities, have represented cities before, against corporations that are responsible for contamination, pollution, to compel them to remediate, or what some people call clean up that contamination. In this particular case, as Barney said, our client is the Tennessee Riverkeeper, a nonprofit organization constituted of members from northern Alabama and Tennessee. And their sole focus, and they give a lot of their time and effort, is to promote the environmental protection of the Tennessee River, to make sure that the Tennessee River is healthy and safe so that people can utilize it for recreation. And that's why they hired our law firm to file this lawsuit in federal court underneath the federal statute called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That law enables the Riverkeeper to act as and us as their attorneys, as private attorneys general, because we believed that 3M and other corporations had dumped or disposed of this PFAS contamination that we believe represents a threat to human health and the environment, and that it needed to be remediated. Yes, we did sue you, but as Barney points out, it wasn't because you created the PFAS, it's not because you disposed of the PFAS, it's because you own properties where the PFAS was located, and that needs to be addressed. And one of those locations is the Morgan County landfill, and part of our lawsuit also has, and one of the things we cared about, of course Barney and you all cared about, was that 3M was going to be paying for all the work that you just heard talked about. I'm not going to talk too much about the Morgan County landfill since that's been covered in some depth. Our main target is 3M as well, and that's because the massive facility on the banks of the Tennessee River that is owned and operated by 3M for decades has a lot of PFAS contamination on it. Even though 3M stopped using PFOS and PFOA, which they used in their manufacturing activities for many years. Even though 3M has engaged, and you'll hear Leon talk about this, in many remedial activities to date. For example, they've created an on-site landfill, not the Morgan County landfill you heard about here tonight, but there's a landfill on their plant site where they essentially consolidated PFAS contamination, walled it off, and put a cap on it. Notwithstanding the fact that 3M is pumping and treating groundwater there to try to make sure that the groundwater that seeps into the river doesn't bring more PFAS contamination along with it. And there's other things they've done. Notwithstanding all that, we filed this lawsuit because we believe that it hasn't gone far enough and that more needs to be done. And the evidence of that is the fact that ADEM has fish eating advisories and prohibitions on fish that are caught in the vicinity of the 3M plant site. And so our purpose in filing this lawsuit, and one of the objectives in the settlement that Barney referred to before, is to get to a point where people can eat the fish in the Tennessee River, where people can utilize the river without being apprehensive about what it might mean to them. So our lawsuit was simple. It was filed, as Barney talked about, injunctive relief. It's to compel 3M and the other defendants to take actions to abate the risks to human health and the environment caused by the PFAS. And in this agreement, they've agreed to do that. That is specifically what they are agreeing to do. We are not seeking any money. You're not going to see any headlines about the Riverkeeper getting money because we weren't looking for any money. We didn't want any money. All we want is a cleanup. So the question is, what would you do in a lawsuit? What would we do in this settlement? First, we'd have to prove that the PFAS is a danger and to get 3M to do a cleanup. Then the next question is, well, what should the cleanup be? Well, one of the things that we knew early on from our experts, and which was reinforced really as we went into mediation and had the benefit of collaborating with some of the leading PFAS experts in the world, largely due to the resources of the Heroin law firm, that everyone agreed that until we could come up with a cleanup plan, more investigation was needed. Now, at first, I think some people in my organization were like, doesn't that sound like we're kicking the can down the road? You're telling me we got to do more investigation before we come up with a cleanup plan? But when you think about it, I look at this as sort of a comparison to a doctor treating a sick patient. The Tennessee River is a beautiful, beautiful river. And I walked around it last night as I meditated about this council and commissioner meeting and about the years. And Mayor, I have to take a quibble with one thing you said was countless hours. We actually counted our hours. We spent over 2,000 hours on this case. And, I said, this river is beautiful, but it's sick. It's got a problem that needs to be addressed. And if a doctor sees somebody come into their office and he says, well, this patient is clearly sick. Maybe they're jaundiced, maybe they're limping, maybe they're skinny, maybe they got a fever. The doctor just doesn't jump up and say, well, this person's got cancer, I got to go give him chemotherapy. No, they're going to run diagnostic studies. They're going to do a biopsy. They're going to do an MRI. They're going to do a CAT scan. So the first thing that we wanted to do in this case was that diagnostic studies on the 3M plant site and its environs to come up with a thorough remedial environmental investigation. And to get there, we had, first of all, the experts look at reams and reams of data that were already available from previous investigations. We had the benefit of summits with our experts and Leon's experts and 3M's experts, where we met in Decatur and walked along the sites, where we met in other places where there was a back and forth. Sometimes I saw the 3M lawyers getting a little, sweaty because their people were maybe talking a little too much. We learned some stuff in there that you probably couldn't learn, in years of discovery. And the experts on our side, collectively, when I say our side, because as Barney said, there was kind of a unique situation where we were mediating this along with the class action case, the St. John case. It was the first day of mediation. The defendant said to us, we're not going to settle with you. If we're not going to settle with them, you're seeking the same thing. We got to do this all at once. So we came up with some very thorough investigations. We're going to get, and this is just a little scratching of the surface. There's going to be sampling of the soils, of the groundwater, of the surface water, of the sediments, of fish. They're going to, 3M that is, inject dye into the groundwater and use technology to find out where it's coming up in the river. So we understand how the groundwater plumes are taking this into the river, where it might be coming up through the sediment, to understand how the PFAS is impacting the water so we can come up with the solution to how to remediate this. So we devised these concepts, and 3M began to agree to them, almost all of them. And around that time, ADEM, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, issued this, what is known as the interim consent order. And in many of the things that we're asking 3M to do, as far as that investigation goes, are reflected in there. In some respects, our investigation goes further. For example, we're going to have 3M dig into that on-site landfill I was talking about. That's not being required by the interim consent order. In some respects, the interim consent order goes further than us. they're dealing a lot with air emissions and air contamination. Our case has been focused on groundwater, water, and the soils. So this investigation will take place under the auspices, if all these settlements are approved, of the interim consent order. Our settlement, which I'll talk a little bit about the impact of that settlement and what the force of it will be, because it will be in a federal court order, and the St. John settlement, which will be approved hopefully by a state court. So to what end is this investigation going to be done? Now, first, let me just say this. The other thing we're going to get is split samples. What is a split sample? So 3M is going to take a sample of sediment or a sample of groundwater. They're going to take it to the lab, and they're going to say, this is how much PFAS is in there. Well, that's good, but we want some split samples so that we can take them to our lab so we can get our own independent read on that. That's something, a normal citizen doesn't get. To what end are we doing this investigation? It's to treat the patient. It's to come up with the remediation plan to have this cleanup done. And our settlement agreement provides for a process. Our settlement agreements provides for a process with regard to the 3M plant site and other locations where PFAS was dumped. So 3M will be sharing all this materials with us, and really importantly and crucially, a fund of up to $2.5 million so we can pay these experts from a variety of disciplines: geologists, chemists, health experts, environmental engineers, so that they can look and read this data. Because as smart as Barney and Leon are, they can't understand all that stuff. This is not for lawyers, right? Lawyers got to get good experts to interpret the data and give it to us so we can apply those facts. And then 3M is going to be required to come up with a remediation proposal that ultimately would get submitted to the EPA and ADEM, but before it goes to them, it goes to us. We get to look at it. Now, we're probably developing some ideas about how to treat the patient before we get that, but once we get that, we get to develop our own treatment plan, if you will, our own remedy. And then there's a negotiation process enshrined in the settlement where, if we're not on the same exact page as 3M, if we think we need to go further in some way, shape, or form, we try to get on the same page, and we have a discussion and negotiation. And if we can't get on the same page, 3M has to submit their proposal for remediation as they are under the interim consent order, but along with that would go our potential, hopefully won't have to have that happen, counterproposal, and demand a meeting with EPA and ADEM. What the remediation will be, we don't know yet. As Barney pointed out, there's some things that are being done specifically, like the capping of the Morgan County landfill. But we don't know what this remediation is going to be and what it's going to cost. The sky is, the limit, frankly. It also, Barney pointed out all these other locations. It's a similar process in that 3M has to do investigations of all these different areas where 3M has disposed of PFAS around northern Alabama, give us the investigation results, pay our experts to look at it, come up with a cleanup plan, pay our experts so that we can come up with potentially a different one or at least analyze it and submit any alternative approach that we may recommend to ADEM. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the other defendants in the case that weren't our main targets but are important nonetheless. Daikin and Toray own plants on the Tennessee River, not that far from 3M. They utilized PFOA in their manufacturing activities. We know that there's PFOA still on their sites as a consequence of their manufacturing activities because of site investigations that they did. Neither of those companies have used PFOA for some time. Otherwise, this chemical, by the way, is known as C8. You may have heard about it as C8. They use alternatives. One, Toray has used a chemical that some people call Gen-X. Just yesterday, EPA has stated that they're going to regulate Gen-X. Daikin uses a chemical that EPA has allowed them to keep kind of secret. It's a proprietary chemical, but we're going to get some information about that. So what these settlements require is that these entities will do compliance audits undertaken by a consultant that has to be mutually agreed to by the plaintiffs and the defendants to look at how PFAS is being discharged into the river through their legal operations over there, whether it's looking at their drainage, their outfalls, their reports to ADEM, whether they're complying with all the rules and regulations. There's a variety of things that compliance audit will deal with. But that will only complement the previous site investigations that I already talked about, where they looked at soils and groundwater. We'll also get a good window of understanding into how PFAS, namely the PFOA and the replacement chemicals I just talked about, from the Torrey and Daikin sites are impacting the river, from some of what 3M is going to do with regard to their investigations. So at our request, demand, whatever you want to call it, negotiation, we got 3M to agree to install additional groundwater monitoring wells that will have the ability to pick up what's coming off of these sites as the groundwater plumes make their way to Bakers Creek in the Tennessee River. We're also going to get a window about what PFOA is maybe in the sediments from the historic operations of Torrey and Daikin as a consequence of what 3M is doing. At the end of those investigations, those two entities are required to come up with a plan to address PFAS on their site so it doesn't create a threat to human health and the environment. Another negotiation process if we don't agree with it. And then if we can't get on the same page, both plans have to be submitted to ADEM. And the last site I talk about here, before I wrap it up, is another landfill, this Morris Farm landfill. That's a landfill that's further away from the river than the Morgan County landfill. It was created, well after the Morgan County landfill, so it's in better condition. It's lined. And nonetheless, it's creating this leachate. We heard a lot of talk about leachate. What is this stuff? One of our experts talked about it and compared it to dumpster juice. If you ever look at a dumpster and you see this liquid that's coming out and it's got all the mess from the garbage, leachate in landfill is that, but it's got PFAS in it, and that's the problem. And that stuff ends up going to DU, and although DU does a lot to get the PFAS out before it goes to the water, some of it does. So what's going on with this Morris Farm landfill in the settlement? Well, they're going to have to cap it fully on the top down the road. They're going to do groundwater investigation for potential treatment of the groundwater there. And they've already begun undertaking a pilot study to ascertain whether or not leachate can be treated. And what does that mean? That means an effective way to get the PFAS out of this dumpster juice before it goes to Decatur Utility, before it goes to the water. So far, the technology has not proven to be workable. You can get the PFAS out of the leachate, but you're still left with a bunch of PFAS that's got to go somewhere, so it's not really doing much good. This settlement provides monies and funds for us to have experts to look at, hopefully, a scientific technology that can be achieved to treat leachate down the road. So, in closing, I recommend that you approve these settlements because, as Barney said, I think that these are, through these three settlements, the best way to achieve the goal that I had when I filed these lawsuits. And that is to come up with a reasonable process to do a couple of things. One, find out how the PFAS from these different locations is impacting the river. Have the funds to have the experts to inform us what that means and how it can be addressed, and have a fair and reasonable process to address it. If this settlement agreement, in our case, is approved, which I'm holding in my hand, it will be signed by a federal judge. The federal judge will sign orders that will give that judge continuing jurisdiction to enforce the settlement agreement and its terms. So if any of the defendants don't live up to its terms, we can go back to the judge and say, you got to enforce this thing. The process that we talked about here is not going to be something that's going to be done behind closed doors. ADEM has said they want it to be transparent, but guess what? Now the Riverkeeper, St. John plaintiffs, the Morgan County commissioners, the City Council of Decatur are all going to have a bright light shining on this process and a voice and a seat at the table for a decision about how to address PFAS at a location that is one of the most important locations when it comes to PFAS contamination, not just in Alabama, not just in America, but in the world. By April 2022, all things getting approved, all the investigation of 3M should be done, and we're going to start moving forward toward the cleanup process. I hope we're all going to be sitting around a table making sure that that cleanup is done right, and that we all work actively, as hard as we did in this case, if not harder, to make sure that the implementation of the settlement is something that we can all be proud of in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I do want to mention a few other things that come up, and I know y'all might be getting a little bored, but this is real important, and I know it's important, or you wouldn't be here, or the people that are watching it live wouldn't be here. You heard us talk about an interim consent order. Interim just means that ADM could add to it later. That doesn't mean that it's going to go away. It's not going away, so I wanted to know that. You heard Bill talk about split samples. As you people know and probably saw, many of you saw, 3M was out on the Aquadome Brookhaven site for months, 60 days. We were the only party that had a company out there. Intersolve was out there every day taking split samples of everything they took, soils, groundwater, everything they took. Our test matched up. It wasn't, that wasn't a problem. But I want to make sure we all know, too, EPA has something they call soil screening levels, SSLs. I learned all these acronyms. And they have one for all sort of contaminants. They have one for PFAS. And the soil screening levels out there on the ball fields are well below the SSLs, which generally means that you don't require any remediation of the top surface. That doesn't mean that ADM may not require them, but I just wanted people to know that have been using them in the past. I also wanted to mention to you about discharges. 3M does not discharge anything to DU now. They don't, I guess DU's over here. They don't discharge anything. Daikin only discharges their sanitary sewer, their restrooms. They don't discharge their process wastewater. Process is through the manufacturing process. They do not discharge that to DU. DU is required since 2009 for all companies to certify that they are not discharging PFAS to our sewer plant. Torrey, under this agreement, he talked about Gen X, has to, they've got a process through a company called Calgon that they're going to remove all Gen X down to a non-detect level, and that's before they could discharge anything to DU. And that's part of the settlement, and I wanted to mention that. You heard me mention, too, earlier about the case going on since 2002. And that seems like a mighty long time, and it is. And Leon was a young, spry lawyer back then. And he still is. But one of the things that Leon and I at lunch today we talked about is that technology has really moved forward. You heard Donnie saying that we even expect technology to get better in the future. If 3M had pushed Leon to go to trial in 2004, we wouldn't have seen what we're seeing today. The science caught up to Leon's in our favor about different testing methods, the effect of it, just everything there could be about PFAS has gotten more understandable by the experts, and that's benefited us. And that's important for us to remember. So I'm going to turn it over to Leon and Dr. Benson and let them tell you all about their part of the case and what they've done.
Thank you, Barney. I am 73, and when this case was filed, I was a child of 52. I want you to know, Mr. Lane, that Eddie St. John died of early onset Parkinson's, and he thought with everything that was in him that Parkinson's came from his work around these chemicals. The law in Alabama did not support that then, and it does not support that today. You have to prove specific causation. But I just wanted you to know that kind young man who worked for 25 years out there also had this terrible disease, and I hope you do well. I want you all to know that over 19 years, we are here today in large part because we sought and got help from the finest experts in the world who do not work for 3M and Daikin and Toray and the other large industries in this country. We had no chance to compete with 3M and Daikin and the others who are out there in this PFAS world. And I'll give you in a minute the names of all of those who have helped us. But I want you to meet Dr. Craig Benson tonight. And I want you to know that in 47 years of law practice, I've never met a man more committed, more experienced, more learned than Dr. Benson is in terms of bringing to litigation around the country the kind of value and the kind of thoughtful concern that it takes to represent cities and counties, to represent large corporations, and in this case, to represent people who are trying to bring something that will benefit the people of North Alabama to this building. And I want you to know, Craig, that the defendants respect you and your colleagues so much. They listen every time you talk. And I'm going to call him Dean. I usually do. Dean Benson just stepped down as Dean of the Virginia School of Engineering for 7 years. There is no more qualified PFA expert in the world than Dean Benson, and I'm going to ask him to come up and spend a few minutes with you. Craig?
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for having me in your community here, both councils and community members who took the time to come. I've been fortunate in my career. I've been in this broader discipline of geoenvironmental engineering, developing landfills and dealing with the associated groundwater issues since the middle of the 1980s, when all this really started to evolve. I'm going to make sure I don't bang that too many times. Being in the middle of the technological evolution that's developed since the middle 80s to what we have today. So I've seen it all in action. I've also been fortunate to work on projects like this all over the world, on every continent except for Antarctica, and I'm still trying to get there. But one of the things that's distinct about this project, and particularly in cases that involve litigation, that's unique in this project, and one of the things I really appreciated about the way Leon and his team put this together, it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about one side trying to get as much money out of another side, or the other side trying to minimize what they have to do. It was about creating a solution that was good for the environment and creating a solution that was good for the community. Those were the guiding principles. And unlike in many activities like this, the two sides often, and the experts on both sides, they're like beating up against each other. This was a very collaborative process. We talked about meetings we had here and in other cities where we'd get around a table and we would argue about what the real issues were, bringing the best minds together to create an understanding of what exists and, most importantly, to develop a path for solutions. That's not that common. You know, everybody could set aside which side they're on and their own personal preference and recognize that everybody brings something important to the table. And that was unique in this case, and it was a lot of fun. I got to tell you, I really enjoyed. And I learned a lot, too, from all the other experts that were involved. But the outcomes of this, I think, are important. Thinking about different sources. First of all, and I'm not going to call it a sewer plant, sorry. It's a wastewater treatment plant or a WWTP to me. As an environmental engineer, I got to stick to the lingo. But issues with the sludge lagoons at the treatment plant, they're going to be remedied. They're going to be excavated. They're going to be processed. The solids from that will ultimately go to the BFI Morris Farms landfill, which is the safest place to store those essentially in perpetuity. They can be safely stored there forever. The county landfill will get a state-of-the-art cap placed over it. We had good discussion about that from Blake earlier. The cap that's being put on that landfill will essentially eliminate that landfill as a source of potential contaminants to groundwater. It uses the state-of-the-art materials, technology that has been developed over the last 20 years, some of which I've been intimately involved with in my own scholarship. The BFI landfill, we talked a little bit about that, managing the amount of leachate it generates. It is a state-of-the-art modern landfill, but it generates a lot of leachate, and that leachate has PFAS in it, and historically it's gone to the treatment plant. But if we can reduce the amount of that volume, that's a real win. So there's a number of strategies in place to reduce that volume of leachate. And then one of the things that many of us are working on, not only at Morris Farms, but really around the globe, is to find ways to treat that leachate and either extract the PFAS and isolate it or sequester it, or minimize its presence in leachate so that the downstream impacts are reduced. That's in motion. We had a little discussion from Bill, and Bill, I'm not going to try the last name, sorry, about the 3M, the 3M plant and the commitment that's made there to understand what's going on at that plant and those properties, and to ensure that the remediation systems that are in place there will provide safe containment forever. I think what's important is that these solutions recognize that we don't have all the answers. And one of the things you really have to guard against in projects like this is trying to get a remedy in place and getting it signed, sealed, and delivered so everybody signs off and says, we're going to do this, we're done. That's not the case here. There's a vehicle in place here to ensure that the job gets done right. And that means collecting more information, understanding really what the problems are in detail, and then being able to develop the right strategies to be able to tackle them. All the parties are making a commitment to make that happen. And I think that's particularly important. And the settlement here is just the vehicle to put all that in place. And that's important as well. I've been working on projects like this. I'm glad to stick around later if some people want to ask questions that you'd like to talk to me about, whatever, or would like to contact me later, that's fine as well. My contact information is in my resume, which is on the website. But glad to answer any questions or address any concerns you may have.
That clicker's up there, you know.
I am proud to say that my father was born in Decatur, grew up here. I was born in Athens. I spent my life in the rivers in North Alabama. When I lost Eddie St. John's case in 2004, we committed to do the best we could to overcome that and to try to help the people of North Alabama get a better life in terms of the quality of this river, to do something about PFAS. We called it PFCs at that time. And we set out to try to survive the fact that the law in Alabama simply did not give us a claim. Today, there is no enforceable legal limit for PFOA or PFOS in soil or water in this state. It does not exist in this state. So Barney's right. If we had been forced to trial any time in the past, we would not have been able to survive that burden of proof. But I want you to know something. We never really did give up. We always thought that if we could just stay the course, if we could stay committed, that we would have an opportunity to be standing here before this commission and this council and ask that this settlement be approved. But it took Dr. Benson, it took Chris Higgins, it took a number of experts that I do want to spend some time on, but I'm not going to have it. We're running late. And I promise you, I did hear you, Ray, when you asked me earlier to get rid of these notes. So I'm not going to go through these 25 pages. I do want to make something clear. Is it the top? There. I know you all know this, but that's the close proximity to the river for the 3M plant, the Daikin plant, the Torrey plant, and you've heard mention of Baker's Creek. And that 3M site is over 900 acres. I think there's over 1,500 or 1,600 acres altogether. But I call it ground zero because it is ground zero for PFAS contamination in the world after the cleanup in Minnesota. What I want you to see, though, is that if you just focus on the 3M plant site, you see a closed landfill right there in the middle. You also see what is designated FSIA area, and then the Daikin soil movement area, a fire training area, Avenue A, the Marsh West closed landfill. All of those, each one of those is an area that 3M has been addressing since 2004 because they sat down with EPA with not one single one of you, no lawyer who represented any of you, and no lawyer who represented any citizen of this state, and made an agreement at that time with EPA to begin to do something about this problem. And we sat down with 3M and said, we want you to do it without a settlement agreement, without an enforceable agreement. Do it because it's the right thing to do for the people who live in these counties. Do it because it's the right thing to do to clean up. The legacy contamination of PFAS is exactly what Barney Lovelace says. It will live with us in perpetuity. We cannot make it go away. We cannot fix it, folks. It is not fixable. We have to try to contain it. We have to try to reduce its discharge. And that's what 3M has been doing since 2004, pursuant to this federal EPA-approved document. We inherited that. You inherited that. We have to deal with that because they are still doing the remediation on that plant site pursuant to that document. Now, all of the other defendants that you've heard Barney mention, Torrey, Daikin, BFI, all of them are regulated. They all have someone that they look to for regulation, and they do testing, and they do evaluations, and they share those results. We know that. And so as we began almost now 15 years ago to try to do something about PFCs, PFAS in this part of the state, we knew we always had to be in a position to come to ADEM and maybe even ultimately to EPA. And I want you to know we have met countless times with the people at ADEM. We sit in a room just like this and we go over what we're doing. We've been to EPA. They know that we are doing the best we can in a private case to try to bring about change. And they have been supportive, but they've not given us one time. I saw you shake your head, and I know you know what it means not to be at the table. We have not been at the table one single time when any one of these manufacturing defendants has been to Montgomery to meet with ADEM or Atlanta to meet with EPA, and that's going to change. And that's going to change as a result of this settlement and what Barney and David did to get y'all into a position where you will have a voice, and I cannot tell you how important that is. I'm going to really go through quickly some of the things that I think are really important, and I am aware that it's already 35 minutes into the game. In 2008, everybody's world changed in those three counties because we found out that DU, who was selling its biosolids to Centergrow, and they were applying them to 5,000 acres of farmers' land, contained PFCs, contained PFOA and PFOS. And those farmers loved the fertilizer. It made things grow. But we had, all of a sudden, we went from the slide you just looked at and what's going on at 3M and what's going on at the river to 5,000 acres. And you heard Barney talk about the law. The law is that if you've got contamination on your land and it costs more than the value of the land to remediate it, you're left with a claim for the value of the land. None of these people are concerned about this fertilizer that is growing their crops. But they are concerned that it does contain PFCs. So from the beginning, since 2008, we have been working to find a way to deal with all of those claims. And we have what is called a subclass that we have alleged and that we're going to try to resolve as a part of this overall settlement for all of those farmers. And that is the $5 million number that you heard Barney talk about earlier. That's about $1,000 an acre for those 5,000 acres, and that is nothing more than an acknowledgement that biosolids were applied to that land, and to the extent that there has been any diminution in value of that property, we can't prove it. We have looked over the years, we have hired experts, we have looked at sales, we've looked at resales, and we cannot find any diminution in value of that land, but we have tested it. And we have gone to the EPA sites that were tested before, and we know that the PFCs that are applied to the topsoil do over time actually reduce in terms of the values in the soil, and they do go into the groundwater. So there is no question that since 2008, we've had a 5,000 acre problem to deal with. Now, Chris Higgins, one of the foremost experts in the country, has been with us since 2011. And I know you can't read all that as quickly as I'm going to ask you to, but there is nobody in America who is any more involved in PFAS remediation than Chris Higgins from Colorado School of Mines. In 2012, we got his colleague John McCrae, who is a foremost expert in hydrogeology. And it's the science of what is going to happen to PFCs that start out in soil or start out in a landfill and then get into water. And John McCrae has been invaluable in looking at and making recommendations about remediation and site characterization. Jennifer Field is a toxicologist and a geochemist from Oregon State, and she has been absolutely instrumental in our evaluation of all of these sites. Jim Reisinger has done all of our testing from Integrated Sciences over in Atlanta, and you have just met Dr. Benson. Let me just make sure we are all on the same page about something. If you look, I don't think it has a light on it, but if you look at the red outline, that's the landfill. And there are wells in the landfill and wells all around the old closed landfill. But there are also wells that are all around the perimeter of the 3M plant site. If you've got all of that legacy PFAS contamination, you've got to contain it. And so it has been applied to the land out there. They have remediated that. They have put the wells into the landfill to see if it's being contained. They did put a containment system around it starting in 2005. And I will say this now, I'll just stop and say it. I am so proud that we, Bill Matsakudis and the Riverkeepers and the St. John plaintiffs and Barney and David know that we are the ones who ask that there be a date certain where that landfill is going to be looked at to make sure that the system that is containing all of that waste is still doing its job. And by 2031, 3M has agreed to remediate that, to actually go in and repair it. And I promise you that is something that you will not find in the joint consent order. Now, let me say this. I agree with what Donnie Lane said. 3M is tried in some of these areas, especially at the plant site, and we give them credit. But I also want to address the interim consent order, because the interim consent order occurred as we were negotiating our settlement, and we were swapping documents. We were meeting countless times to consider what were the various options that we had, alternatives that we had. And in 2019, 3M and EPA and ADEM sat down and discussed a problem that had come up with the release of two compounds. And for whatever reason, whatever legal reason, whatever public relations reason, whatever reason 3M had to sit down with ADEM and enter into that interim consent order, it's good for us. I promise you, it's good for the council and for the commission. It's good for the people of North Alabama. But I can tell you, because I've held one in one hand and one in the other, and they track each other. And I am telling you tonight that the interim consent order is broader, of course it is, than our settlement agreement could be. But much of the remediation activity, much of what is called for in the interim consent order is to be found in our agreement and in the versions of our agreement that existed back in 2019 and 2020. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. I am thrilled for the interim consent order to be where it is, and it will give accountability over the years to what 3M has committed to do. I want you to know I can't, on a scientific basis, tell you what each of these means, but I can tell you that when you start looking at the values of the PFAS that is coming into and then going out of the 3M plant site over time, what you will find is that after they instituted the GAC system and started filtering through the GAC system, there is a remarkable decrease in the PFAS content of the part going in and the part going out. This is a list of what we called operable units. They're simply the parts of our settlement agreement. And it starts with the plants, and it goes to all of the wastewater treatment facilities, and there is one there that says molten. Molten took leachate from BFI. It was contaminated. It essentially shut down their whole system. They had a lagoon in the back, just like Barney's describing in his lagoon, and it's the hottest of any levels we have ever seen in any place that we can find. There was a well very close to the side of that lagoon, and it was so hot with PFAS, so we had to do something about it. As a part of this settlement, not in the consent decree, but as a part of this settlement, we have been able to get that completely remediated. Pewright McAnally is involved in that. I met you at the plant site the other day. There is going to be a total remediation, and Craig mentioned that all of the waste that will come from that remediation is going into a Subtitle D landfill that BFI owns. So we're going to clean it up, and it is a wonderful part of what Barney described as going out and finding where all of these sites are located, and to the extent we can, do the best we can to mitigate them. All right. Every one of the landfills that were historic landfills have now been approached by 3M, and every one of those landfills is being addressed as part of our judgment in St. John and as a part of the Riverkeepers agreement that is going to be approved in federal court. There's going to be accountability in the future as a result of the way these settlements were negotiated. Oh, it does work. This is a slide that indicates what Craig Benson and John McCrae and other experts did that was accepted almost 100% in the version of the settlement agreement that we have brought to you all today. And what it does is this: it embodies the process that Dr. Benson said he's been through. Rather than taking hundreds of depositions in the last 5 years, the longest mediation I've ever been associated with, we have sat with these experts and we have had what Bill calls summits, but we have sat and we have looked at the problem. We've gotten the experts to get together with 3M and the other experts. They've been given the ability to pick the phone up and call each other and talk to each other without the lawyers ever being involved. I've never been involved in anything like that. And what I would say is that it does represent the collaborative effort that has resulted in these settlement agreements. But my point is, our experts recommended each of those changes. Each of those changes was accepted by the defendants, primarily 3M, and then each of those changes also appears to some extent in the interim consent order. All right, I want to talk to you just a little bit, if I could, about Barney's slide. I do want to say that they weren't a plaintiff. They've been a defendant since 2015. And to the extent that you are the clients, I want you to know that they've done a wonderful job for you, for the commission and the council. They have obtained relief that you are not entitled to under the law. And I want to actually point out that the law in Alabama, unlike the law in Minnesota, and all of you can Google it and you'll see that $850 million settlement in Minnesota. That is a claim for damage to natural resources, and it does not exist in Alabama. It existed in Minnesota, and Chris Higgins was one of the first two witnesses to be called in that case. And I know about that case. We've got all the depositions, we've got all the discovery, we've got the entire database for all of the documents that were produced. We know what went on in Minnesota. We don't have the law in Alabama to support that claim. But I will tell you that $35 million of that $98.4 million is over and above what the law would provide. So just like us, if St. John had been forced to trial a few years ago, if you force the city and the county to trial today, you can't obtain that, because that landfill where that $35 million came from isn't worth, as he said, the paper that the deed is printed on. So I want the councilman and the city council to know that after essentially 15 years of trying to make things better, essentially bringing in the last 5 and 6 years the best experts we can bring to deal with a problem that we can't fix, that we can mitigate, that we can make better, then I think that this is a wonderful settlement for everybody who is trying to deal with something that we can't make go away. One other thing. Barney's, I can't make it work now. There. Barney's other slide. Let me just say that it is important to everybody that you know that what is represented there are accurate numbers. And there's another approximately $60 million that is in hard costs that's going to be spent immediately by 3M for remediation that's going to be done and investigation. So this is a $310 million settlement in terms of those hard numbers. But the most important icon up there is that question mark next to that dollar sign. Because just like when you heard ADEM say that the value of the interim consent orders relief and remediation was unlimited, it is unlimited in our settlement agreements. 3M has no cap. When it addresses the landfill on the plant site, it could cost hundreds of millions of dollars at that point just to deal with something that they know has to be dealt with. You've got 40 acres of very, very toxic waste sitting out there in a landfill that is not anything close to what Blake McAnally described. It is essentially sitting on bedrock with a steel structure around it. So you have as a part of this agreement something that will address that condition, and it will also address pumping and treating and looking at these values forever. Because as long as that plant site is there, 3M will have to pump and treat. So I am, as I said, one of you. And we've worked hard to bring this to you tonight. We are perfectly willing to answer any of your questions, but I want to thank you all for the opportunity to work with your fine lawyers and to, in a sense, bring an opportunity for all of this to take place. Thank you very much.
I want to just mention a couple of things. You heard about extracting groundwater and treating it in a GAC system, which is a carbon-activated system. I want you to understand treating groundwater and treating leachate are two different things. You can treat the groundwater, but you can't treat the leachate. And the last thing I want to say is I use, if you can use an analogy in Alabama that relates to sports, it always kind of resonates with people. And I always tell people when I did play sports, I'm old, not quite as old as Leon, but I'm close. When you play sports with somebody that's better than you, you play better. And I will say that I think David would agree with me that being in this case with Leon and Bill and their teams made us better lawyers and resulted in a settlements that both David and I recommend to the council and to the commission to approve.
All right, thanks, Barney. Now we will hear public comments, and I will just call on the folks that we have signed up in the order that I got them. First, I have Mr. Spagnola, although I think he may have left. Mr. Spagnola, are you? He's not here. All right, next we have Mr. Whiteside, if you would like to make a few comments. We do have a 3-minute time cap, and when the 3 minutes hits, I'll just ask you to wrap up your thought. Thanks.
Thank you. I was not planning on speaking tonight. I'm speaking as a citizen right now, and not as a representative of Riverkeeper. Thank you, Bill, for speaking on our behalf. Every week in Decatur, I get asked about where are the public health studies and concerns brought to me about severe public health impacts to people that are far too young to experience them. So, we talked about parts per trillion, and it was tried to minimize how parts per trillion is such a small amount, but these PFAS chemicals, are so toxic that they have to be leveled and measured in parts per trillion. So that is how serious of a public health risk we are talking about, that they are measured in parts per trillion. Some of our independent samples have revealed 50,000 parts per trillion of PFAS at some of these old landfills. Those are some of the highest numbers in the country. Those would have serious health impacts to this area. So my main point is, where are the public health studies? We need public health studies in this area. We need to know why people that are far too young are experiencing public health impacts. And we should do group studies, reveal them to the public. It's the least our public servants can do for us. Finally, there's been a pattern indicator of the chemical industry capturing this town since the 1950s. We have seen numerous red flags that pattern continues to go on today, from leaked emails to deleted Facebook posts to questions about which side the city's on. The people of Decatur have a right to ask their public servants some very tough questions, especially related to public health impacts and studies. And, we do not know the full impact of these chemicals in this area. We don't even know some of the confidential chemicals that Dyke in America is producing and some of these others. We have a right to know what chemicals they're making. If we don't know the names of the chemicals, we certainly can't know whether they are impacting our health. So that's another question we have. And until those questions are answered, there should be a moratorium on producing more of these chemicals rather than allowing them to double expansion. So I'm again speaking on behalf of my neighbors, on behalf of the public health of Morgan County and North Alabama. And we also need to know what's going on with our air. And thank you very much for this time. And we have a right to ask you all some tough questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whiteside. Next on the list, I have Mrs. Vinson. Is she still here?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharika Vinson, and thank you for the opportunity
for allowing me to speak and be heard tonight. I want to thank the City Council, the County Commission, the attorneys involved, and the subject matter experts for your work coming to this settlement. But I want to talk about, we've had a beautiful presentation on the path forward, but I want to address a concern that I have, and that is the fact that the $35 million part of the settlement that's going to be used to replace the Aquadome. I was a little concerned to see that there's already been sites mentioned as far as a replacement for the Aquadome. I would ask the City Council if we could not have a public forum such as this one to get the citizens to come in and comment about their thoughts of the replacement for the Aquadome. That's a center that's so important to the community. My father used to go there. I went there as a kid, and my daughter took swimming lessons there. I know this isn't exactly on point with what we're discussing tonight, but based on what's been presented, I know it's going to be a next step. So again, I just ask, for transparency's sake, that the citizens, especially the ones who, all the citizens of Decatur, because it really does affect us all, to be allowed to have their voices heard as far as the next facility. And just to point out, whoever did this, mock-up of a future site, you did an excellent job. But one thing that I noted was that, they're saying that the possible future site is just over a mile away from the Aquadome, but that doesn't take into account accessibility as far as students and children and people who may be walking to these centers. So I am asking the City Council, the mayor, if we could have a public forum specifically to address the future site of the Aquadome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vinson. I think that's definitely a possibility to have something like that. We, of course, have meetings every single Monday. But if we need to do something off-site from the council chambers, we can do that. So thank you for that. And last on my list, I have I believe it says Canon. Yes, ma'am. Okay. He would like you to come if you would like to. You don't have to.
I'm Soroya Cannon, and my main concern was about the public health study for the group of people that's been basically affected by this area. I think there should be some studies on the health of things that's going on, because there are people that have problems, like he said, with their kidneys and other parts of their body that needs to be addressed to see if this chemical that has been put into the air and into the ground has some effect on their health. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that is everyone I had signed up to speak. Did I miss anyone in the front? I don't think so. All right, we'll move into the resolution that is on the agenda, and that is resolution number 21-355. And this is for the City Council for the City of Decatur. Approved settlement with 3M and settlements in the St. John and Tennessee Riverkeeper cases, and I will entertain a motion. The motion by Mr. McMasters, second by Mr. Pike. Any discussion?
I would like to simply say that I've been on the City Council for 25 years, and many of you here know that. And over that time, I have found it increasingly difficult to, just for lack of better terms, accept what Mr. Lovelace says on face value. So I really have a concern with the amount of the settlement. With all due respect to what Mr. Ashford said, I have great concern about the amount of the settlement. I have concern about the amount of the settlement as to the amount that goes to our attorney. We all know that he was paid on an hourly, or that company was paid on an hourly rate, and now they're getting a contingency. So I have concerns about that. And So I just have a difficult time with this entire process as we sit with it now. I do appreciate the amount of oversight that we're going to have now, the remediation efforts. I appreciate those things. And I would like to ask, where are we? We have two entities in the Aquadome. One of them is a Parks and Rec entity that works out of there, and the other one is a youth services program. And we've not talked about where the youth services and 3M didn't address the fact that youth services is, that we're going to deal with that. So where is youth services going with this process? Where are we going with that? Where are we going to place them?
I think that question, if I could, Mr. Ladner, I'd like to address the comments Mr. Jackson made about me. You know, Billy, when we met last week, you and me and Herman, the mayor, you made some of those same comments. So I went back, and I sent you this text on May 20th of 2020. And I mentioned it in that meeting. I saw you that day out in the community and talked to you for 15 or 20 minutes about this case. And I sent you a text, and it said, this is on May 20, 2020. Billy, thanks for talking with me today. I just sent you 2 emails to your city email address. If there's another email address I need to use, please let me know. As I mentioned in the second email, please let me know if you can meet with me and Herman anytime next Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. I have other emails here, those 2 emails, and several other emails sent to you during this litigation. And you know how many times I heard back from you, Billy, to ask any questions?
0, because when we talked out there, it wasn't like, Barney, that, let's be clear about this. Let's be very clear. You didn't reach out to me. You happened to see me out in the community. And that was when you took the opportunity to reach out and say, we should talk about this. And at that particular point, we were going through a process, and we were nowhere near a settlement at that point, nowhere near that. So at that particular point, we were looking at NDAs, and you know where I was on that. So when
I didn't ask you to sign an NDA, Billy.
we had talked about it before.
We didn't ask you, and I was working with the city council.
We had talked about it before.
Billy, I was working with the city council president at the time and the pro tem at the time. And I reached out to you, and I sent you emails, and I invited you to talk, and you know where I've been, and you've never come and talked to me or picked up a phone. You can criticize me all you want, but I'm going to tell you, I'm extremely proud of this settlement. I am proud of the work that David and I did, and if you wanted to have addressed this over the past 5 or 6 years, you knew where I were.
You're exactly right, Barney. Let's be clear about this, though. We have other settlements. When you say that the state only allows a certain amount, we have other settlements that will be coming out very shortly in much smaller. Let's take Ewan, for example. Ewan's going to be, what, 5% of our population? And they're going to have probably between a $30 and $59 million settlement. And when you compare that to Decatur's settlement, it's enormous compared to what we're getting. So you're right. I didn't respond to you because you saw me on just a chance meeting. You weren't trying to reach out to me, Barney. So let's be clear about that as well. But I do want to know where we are with youth services, where they're going to go. What's the plan for that?
Mr. Jackson, I can address that. Now, I've had an opportunity to talk with the Youth Services Director, Mr. Watkins, as well as Park and Recreation as it relates to the Aquadome. The Aquadome is a very safe work environment and will be used for the next period of 3 years probably until the new facility is constructed wherever the council determines that should be. The facility has been safe. There's nothing that will bring harm to any of our personnel.
But beyond, when we build a new Aquadome or a new recreational facility, where does youth services go then?
That will be for the council to decide.
So we're settling now. We're completing a settlement tonight. More than likely it's going to pass. We're completing a settlement that we're not including resources to build or take care of youth services. Is that accurate?
That'll be for the council to decide where to what to do with youth services,
Yeah,
whether or
this-
not that's going to be for I think the existing facility, there'll be a council agenda item in the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is about the facility, not about what will happen inside of it. And Mr. Watkins did reach out to me through a text and told me he wanted to talk about that very topic, and I told him I was willing to sit down anytime he wanted to talk about it, and we could have that conversation. I'm certainly willing to sit down with you, Mr. Jackson, and have that conversation as well. But this is about replacing that facility, and I'm more than open to have the conversation for where youth services under Brandon's leadership needs to go.
So I guess my question is the youth services facility, as we're sitting here tonight, are we saying that youth services is going to be a part of the new facility? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's a conversation we can have, but that's not what this settlement is about, to name where Parks and Rec will go, or what offices will be in that facility, or how many basketball courts it's going to have, or how many volleyball courts it's going to have, or that's just not what this is about. This is about the funding of a new facility, and I'll be glad to have any conversation you'd like to have about.
Like I said,
where
I
DYS needs
understand,
to go.
I understand that it's about a new facility, but we've specifically stated the Aquadome, and I guess I'm just really trying to figure out, we added, in the early 2000s, we added youth services to the Aquadome facility as a standalone, and I'm concerned that we need to have a location for that already set out, and it just kind of bothers me that we are at this point in this process without having committed when we've got a finite number of dollars, and that concerns me, that we've
Yeah.
gotten to this point
Mr.
without.
Jackson, you've been very adamant about keeping Carrie Matthews in its current location, and this council has tried every way in the world to support your request in that, to the point to where we're eager to get the final report from our engineering department, but it sounds like that facility is not going to support a renovation there, which is going to require a new facility. And I would think, I know this is going beyond what the council president wanted to discuss tonight, but to accommodate your request, that youth services will likely have I believe, a new facility.
Well, that's good. I guess, I mean, that's fine.
But that's not what you wanted.
I mean, no, that is what, I wanted, and again, that's a different conversation, but,
It is now, but that's not what you wanted.
yeah, what is not what I wanted?
You've always wanted to stay where Carrie Matthews is.
Yeah, I want the recreation center there, Mayor.
Yes, sir.
I want the recreation center there. But I guess my concern is that we've gotten this far down the road. We've said it, we know the dollar amount, but we don't know specifically where youth services is going to fit into that. So that, to me, should have been a part of this. And so that's my concern at this
That
point.
would fit into the new facility.
I think.
We've already decided that it's fitting into the new facility?
I think nothing has been decided about even where it's going to go. Ms. Vinson brought up a good question there. None of that's been decided. Nothing's been decided about what exactly will even be in it. This is about the settlement that 3M has agreed to replace the facility. Who will go there, what will go there, what it will look like, what color the paint will be is for another day. That is not what we're discussing tonight. We absolutely have to find a great place for Brandon to lead DYS, and I will say it on the record tonight, I'm fully committed to that, and I hope you'll be a part of that process.
I will be a part of that, but okay, that's fine. And I'll say one more thing. When Barney wanted to address what I said, this has come over time. That lack of trust has come over time. It's not just this one incident, Barney, so it's come over time.
Okay.
You're exactly right.
Any other
Good with that.
comments from council? I would say let's not be distracted about personalities and, the very minute issues that we've just discussed for the last 10 minutes. The real issue is what was presented at the beginning of this presentation, which is the goals of the mediation, which was remediation of existing issues that have been there for decades, making sure that those were taken care of, making sure that any future potential harm to our citizens is addressed, in the future, and then making sure that the city and county and DU are taken care of and protected from a monetary standpoint. And we have accomplished through this settlement every single one of those goals and more. And we have I think it's important for the citizens to know that you heard from two attorneys tonight that took on 3M. They aren't on our side. They were taking on 3M. We were defendants in the suit that they were plaintiffs' attorneys for, and in the Riverkeeper suit, Mr. Matsakudis. Good. They both said this is an unbelievably great settlement for the city of Decatur. And for us to argue about this stuff and personalities, for us to not approve this after the two attorneys who brought suit against 3M tell us to accept it, I think would be a major mistake. And so I will support it, and that's all I have to say about that. Any other discussion from the City Council? I have a motion by Mr. McMasters, a second by Mr. Pike, and we will take a roll call.
Ladner.
Aye.
McMasters.
Aye.
Jackson.
No.
Pike.
Aye.
Pepper.
Aye.
All right, resolution number 21-355 is approved with a vote of 4-1, and I will turn it over to Chairman Long.
All right, it's been a long time since I got to say anything, it's only been a couple hours, Barney, so, I want to take about 15 minutes if you don't mind, and just, no, I'm just joking, I don't get paid by the hour, so, but I do want to say that I do appreciate everything that we've heard tonight, the work by the attorneys, Barney and David have done a great job representing Morgan County, but also, Leon, Bill, everybody that's been involved in this thing, I want you to know that from our standpoint, we know there's much work to be done. We know it don't end tonight. It's just a lot of work to be done. But y'all brought us to the table. We now have a seat here from now on to make sure that everything goes like it's supposed to go. And so we just want you to know from the County Commission that we appreciate everything that's been said tonight. These guys here at the table, like I say, have represented us for years and done a great job. We appreciate what y'all have done for us. And we couldn't have got here, without everybody being on board and working together. And so I want you to know I appreciate it. And I think you'll see in a few minutes how much our County Commission appreciates it. Has anybody here got any comments? If you don't, we'll move with the resolution. We only have 2 items on our agenda, and y'all have heard the resolution. You've had time to read it. You had the information now since last week also, and you've heard everything here tonight. So new business, item number 1, adopt resolution approving settlement with 3M and settlements in the St. John and Tennessee Rivers Keepers case. Do I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Motion, Mr. Clark.
Second.
Second, Mr. Vest.
Clark.
Yes.
Vest.
Yes.
Abercrombie.
Yes.
All right, motion carries unanimous. The next item we have, unless y'all just want me to talk a few more minutes, I know the Braves probably in about the 3rd inning, but if you don't, I'll ask for a motion and a second to adjourn the County Commission portion of this meeting.
So moved.
Motion, Mr. Abercrombie.
Second.
Second, Mr. Vest.
Clark.
Yes.
Vest.
Yes.
Abercrombie.
Yes.
Motion carries, and I knew it would because they don't get paid by the hour either.
And I'll, thank you, Chairman. We'll adjourn our meeting like we always do, first off by asking if any of our directors have anything they want to add. I bet they don't. Mayor, anything for you to add?
No, sir. Well, yes, there is. There was an email that came from David Langston on February the 23rd of 2018 saying that he had been told that Bill Brewer had been, and his firm had been dismissed from representing 3M. And then on 3/26, we received an email from Barney where 3M attorneys had contacted him and they wanted to talk. And boy, that was the day that things changed and this case started moving forward. Do you remember that, Barney? David? Yes, sir. That's whenever things changed, and we celebrate that time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Anything else from city council members? All right, we will stand adjourned. Thank you.